very much. I will speak a little bit about COP22 and what we should expect and what we need to happen. So the Paris Climate Agreement is, of course, notable and historic because it's universally adopted. This is the first time since the UN Framework Convention was signed in 1992 that we have an action plan in which all governments are obligated. That's key. The Kyoto Protocol, for example, was a protocol that applied to only a subset of governments, and the United States used that argument as a main argument for not implementing the Kyoto Protocol, because it said, why should the US do it if China is not doing it? Now we have a universal agreement. I believe that that makes a political and moral difference that's significant, because it will make it much harder for any country to unilaterally declare that it is not part of this. The essence of the Paris Climate Agreement is to keep warming well below 2 degrees C. Well below is not defined, so we don't know exactly what that means. It could mean 1.8 degrees, 1.7 degrees, and it also says, of course, to aim to limit the rise of temperature to 1.5 degrees C. We know from the IPCC reports and the voluminous scientific literature that even the 2 degrees is extremely difficult. Well below 2 degrees is therefore harder, even though we don't know what it means exactly. And 1.5 degrees is almost unachievable, except with an overshoot. And we will hear from IPCC in 2018 about that. The right framing of this part of the Paris Agreement is, as I mentioned earlier, the carbon budget, which is the idea that there is a certain amount of carbon that can be released into the atmosphere and still give a given probability of staying below a certain target. To give you an idea, the mainstream view is that to have a 2/3 probability of staying below 2 degrees C, so still 1/3 that you miss it, but 2/3 that you stay below, the carbon budget or CO2 budget is on the order of 900 billion to 1 trillion tons of CO2 cumulative further emission. The problem is that we're emitting right now nearly 40 billion tons per year. And so if you just do the arithmetic, it means that it's about 20 to 25 years at the current emission rate left, and that only gives you a 2/3 chance of success and of a target that is less strict than what has been agreed, a 2 degree C target. So we're with our backs to the wall. The 1.5 degrees C is almost unachievable because one common estimate referred to is that the remaining carbon budget is about 400 billion tons of emission. That means 10 years left at the current rate. Now, that means not 10 years at the current rate and then slowly declining. It means 10 years and stop, because you filled the carbon budget. So the point is that to achieve the Paris Agreement requires concerted, global, bold action. Very bold. Much bolder than governments have imagined so far. And much bolder than the normal processes will lead to. Under the Paris Agreement, there are several clauses that now need to be implemented. One part is the target to the year 2030, called the Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. Governments have announced their intended NDCs, or their INDCs. If you add up what they have announced, you don't come close to the 2-degree limit. We're still way above. So they will file NDCs under the Paris Agreement. Then there's another clause, very important, which calls on all governments to make longer-term plans, not to 2030, which is the NDC, but to 2050. This is extremely important. It's Article 4, Paragraph 19, because without looking longer term, there's no chance that even the short-term measure will be very desirable. If you take short-term steps to reduce emissions modestly, but in a way that doesn't allow you to continue to zero, you just lock yourself into a bad situation. This is what the U.S. policy, unfortunately, is right now. The U.S. policy says we'll go from coal to natural gas and thereby reduce emissions. But natural gas is a fossil fuel, and by creating a natural gas-based economy, we make it impossible to get to a zero-emission economy. So we shouldn't go from coal to gas. We should go from coal to wind, coal to solar, coal to hydro, and so forth. That's not what's in the INDC of the United States right now. So there are a few other key parts of the climate agreement to take note of. A second theme is adaptation and resilience. The commitment of governments to cooperate, to build adaptation to climate change already underway, and to build resilience. In terms of what's already underway, it's worth noting that this year we are 1.3 degrees C warmer than the pre-industrial level. About 0.2 of that is because of the El Nino. So we're probably baseline about 1.1 degrees C warmer. We're already more than halfway to 2 degrees C with rapid increases along the way. So we need adaptation also for the very big adjustments that are taking place. I'm sorry, very big disturbances. Then there are two other points to mention. I mentioned losses and damages, which is the idea of compensation for countries that are being hit. Of course, the rich countries responsible for the historic emissions have resisted any clarity on this point. And so there's no specific program, but there is a legal commitment to cover losses and damages, but it's a very soft commitment, though morally it's a crucial commitment, because this is one of those cases where those who suffer are the poorest, the most vulnerable, the least responsible, and the future generation. So it's a pure moral question against the power of the major countries and the major interests at stake. The final part that needs to be negotiated is the financing, because for 24 years since the UN Framework Convention was agreed, the idea has been that the rich countries would help the poor countries both to implement a low-carbon energy system and to adapt. And the financing to this date is ill-defined, is not generous, is not forthcoming, and it is very much on the agenda. The famous pledge is $100 billion for the poor countries from the rich countries by 2020. But what constitutes that money, how much it has to be aid rather than market-based, what is called climate financing, so far has never been delineated, again, mainly because the United States has said, we don't want to talk about this. And to my amazement, they have filibustered for 20 years to avoid any serious discussion of the financing, and that's where we are until today. Last year, the OECD issued a report which I found to be rather scurrilous, said, oh, we're already at $62 billion out of the $100 billion financing. And the poor country said, what, where, huh? We don't see any money, what are you talking about? And the OECD, it was a disgraceful report actually. The OECD never specified where, what counts, how did you do this, what are the definitions? Because that's a rich country club that decides what it wants to say and what it wants to announce. And the poor countries were looking around, oh, we don't see $62 billion, and we don't know what you're talking about. So this issue is, again, very non-transparent. The final point that I should mention is that the treaty, or the agreement, the Paris Agreement, recognizes the crucial role of land and land use and emissions from agriculture, land use, and land use change. This is a big deal. Again, the mechanisms for how to implement such an agreement on a global scale are not in place. So let me summarize and then talk about COP22. This is a very important agreement with all its weaknesses and flaws because it is universal, because the goals are strong, even if the means are not clear and not even settled. I think we have to defend the Paris Agreement and then defend its implementation in a moral, principled, and effective manner, which means being very clear to every government, you must now move to implement this. I believe the agreement is even strong enough, I hate to say it in this way and in this place, but I think it's even strong enough to resist Donald Trump if that horrible eventuality came. Because unlike Kyoto, the United States, if it walked out, would be walking out against 195 other signatories. It would have no claim other than we abandon the rest of the world. And I believe the rest of the world would say, no, you don't. One of the aims right now is to have the agreement put into force before the next president comes. There is very good chance of this now. More than 60 countries have ratified the agreement, and it goes into force when two conditions are met. More than 55 countries ratifying, and those countries representing 55% or more of the global emissions. We're not there yet on the share of emissions, but we are there on the number of countries. But we're already at 47 or 48% of emissions, so there's a very good chance this will go into force before the end of this year. That doesn't mean that the United States doesn't act in a renegade way if this strange occurrence would happen, which is unfortunately truly possible. But it does mean that the world would not fall apart and say, oh, this is over. I think there would be a united front actually from the rest of the world saying, no, you can't leave. The treaty says you're here for 5 years. We'll sit down and talk. We'll discuss, and I believe things will not fall apart actually. Now, practically speaking, I have a theory which I've expressed this morning, but I'll repeat here and then I will come to a conclusion. To my mind, of course, vested interests are a big issue here, but even more is the complexity of the challenge. I believe the most important problem we face is that this is requiring a transformation of the world energy system in a period of roughly 30 to 40 years. This is the deepest change ever conceptualized for the world economy in an organized way. No one has ever made an idea that the whole world agrees to transform a fundamental sector. And the energy sector is fundamental to the functioning of the economy. And so to make this transformation, you also want to ensure that your economies will not collapse in the middle of this transformation. In other words, that you can really make the operation, do the surgery, and come out stronger in the end. My analysis, which comports with the analysis of many, many students of this, is that this is feasible. And I mentioned this morning some of the particular pathways to this. Basically, every fossil fuel power plant that ends is replaced by a near zero carbon energy source going forward. And by around 2030, all buildings and vehicles will be electric rather than fossil fuel based. That technology is within reach. In fact, major companies are already planning for it. But governments have not analyzed this. They do not have long-term plans, and they face very powerful resistance, of course, from powerful actors, the oil industry. And some countries live on oil, of course. This is their basic means of livelihood. So we need serious analytics as much as anything else. To that end, I'm going to be co-hosting the organization that I lead for the UN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. We'll be co-hosting with the host government, the government of Morocco, a 3-day conference, November 14 to 16 at the COP, called the Low Emissions Solutions Conference. The concept is it's not negotiations. There's no outcome document. It's engineers in the room. So the idea is to have, for the first time ever at a COP, by the way, even though it's the 22nd such meeting, a room of up to 1,000 specialists on what actually to do, not to negotiate, not to bind their governments, but only to discuss the technical pathways to actually achieving success. So if you're interested in participating there and you'll be at COP, let me know because I can get you a ticket. Quite seriously, it's a first ever meeting at COP where it's not just speeches of how important this is, and it's not negotiating legal terms, it's actually asking the practical questions. What's the state of technology in various areas, and how can national governments make these plans? Also, we need, and it's heavily focused on the energy sector, we also need a similar analytical effort on land use, which is crucial. And I will be hosting a meeting of global scientists on October 20 at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis outside of Vienna to bring together land use specialists and biodiversity specialists to model how we can implement the land use component of this treaty. Again, very few governments have land use strategies that are linked to the Paris Climate Agreement. So I'll end here by saying that, of course, there's vested interests, there's the short-termism of politics, which Stefano mentioned. By the way, the fact that the world's safety and survival depends on politicians whose interest is getting reelected shows how poorly designed our political institutions are. Because I think one of the least interesting questions on the whole planet is whether any individual politician wins re-election. It's something we care almost nothing about. But what we do care about is that they implement serious long-term strategies. So we have a deep misalignment of institutions and need right now. And that, I think, is a quite serious problem. I propose to take this issue outside of the political cycle by urging governments to create longer-term institutions that can implement this without having to face the year-to-year electoral cycle. We need to disassociate the short-term electoral cycle with the long-term transformation pathway. But to do that, governments need to understand the technological and economic and financial substance of the challenge in a way that they have not so far. And that's why I think we need to put the moral pressure on the key actors. We need to tell the public repeatedly, this is a matter of survival, but there's a bright future ahead by doing the right things. This is not disaster. This is actually the way to a better future for the world. And third, we need to work on the analytical side so that governments can actually have long-term strategies and plans to implement what they've agreed to do. Thank you.